Along the way, we lost the ability to synthesize a national interest from all these disparate interests. So there's no strategy. There is an accumulation of tactics.
Even at that time, there were already heavily stratified vectors of influence in American policy.
I don't think I ever once heard an argument about how to influence a foreign situation. What I heard was, what can we get away with vis-a-vis Congress?
You immediately delegitimize Hezbollah as a resistance movement.
But they are safe. Jews in Israel are not safe.
Military isn't a substitute for diplomacy, and the CIA certainly isn't a substitute for diplomacy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. You can also support us by joining as a YouTube member, be a Patreon, or donate small amount in the link given in the description below. But the least you can do is to watch this show, hit like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight. I am thrilled to introduce former U.S. Ambassador Chas Freeman and former U.S. Marine Corps officer Scott Ritter. Ambassador Freeman served at the U.S. Foreign Office, the State and Defense Department, and Scott served in the U.S. Marine. Both Scott and Chas are prolific authors and public speakers. They are most well known for being critical of existing paradigms of U.S. foreign policy, which we will discuss today. Ambassador Freeman and Scott, welcome to India and Global Left.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having me.
There is so much to discuss given the new U.S. administration has fallen in love with signing executive orders. But I want to start with a more general question, given both of you have worked in State and Defense Department as well as in the armed service. And my question would be, who controls the U.S. foreign policy, and why is it the case that most often than not, it is not just not in the interest of people at large, but it's also not in the interest of American public? Ambassador Freeman, if you would like to go first, and then Scott can respond.
The United States many years ago pioneered a domestic policy process by which we franchised special interests with the power to define the policies that was of most concern to them, and then appoint the appropriate people to implement that policy. And so you can see this, for example, there's a Bureau of Handicapped Affairs at the Department of Commerce. It's always headed by a handicapped person. That bureau was set up in response to pressure from handicapped people. It does a pretty good job. Anyway, eventually we extended this after the end of the Cold War, when it seemed that foreign policy was a trivial pursuit and couldn't kill us all, as JFK, John F. Kennedy, said during the Cold War. You know, if I make a mistake in domestic policy, it could embarrass me. But if I make a mistake in foreign policy, it could kill us all. That went away. And the sense was, why not make foreign policy the same way we do domestic policy? So the Black Caucus got control of Haiti because it's inhabited by Black people. The Save the Whale crowd got Norwegian policy because the Norwegians hunt whales. The Zionist lobby got Israel and the Middle East. Eastern European countries got the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. And along the way, we lost the ability to synthesize a national interest from all these disparate interests. So there's no strategy. There is an accumulation of tactics, and an accumulation of tactics does not add up to a strategy. We have, I think, the history of the National Security Council best illustrates this. There was no such thing. There was Andy Goodpaster, who was the NSC secretary for Dwight Eisenhower. John Kennedy came into office. He wanted a more hands-on cerebrally focused foreign policy. So he hired 6 people, Rostow and Bundy and other famous names who got us into Vietnam. And they basically outflanked the national security bureaucracy. So the 6 of them, did a lot of things. And then the NSC grew. By the end of the Nixon era, it was 48, not 6. By the end of the Obama era, it was 600. And and a lot of them were people who were seconded to the White House from departments and agencies, not on the books, not responsible to anyone, no vulnerability to congressional oversight, no confirmation process, entirely at the will of the president or, in fact, the empire-building national security advisor. And there's a Chinese analogy here that I think applies. They talk about the frog in the well. The frog at the bottom of the well looks up, he sees a circle of light way, way up there, and he imagines that's the universe. Well, there are now 600 frogs in 600 wells, each one of them seeing a separate part of the sky. And the frogs can't really hear each other too well because they're all in different wells, and the people who are supposed to pull this all together don't. So we have a foreign policy which is based in no small measure on delusions. I liken it to a planetarium. If you've been in a planetarium, you'll see the sky will turn, you don't know what's going on outside the planetarium. If you're in Chicago, as you are, it might be blowing and heavy snow coming off the lake, but you're unaware of that. For you, the world is the skies created by the planetarium projected inside the building. And that's a lot of what's going on now. It's very detached from reality, and it produces endless disasters. And I should say no one's been a better chronicler of those in the military realm than Scott. So I'm delighted to join him with you.
I think this is a good segue, Scott. If you can add, how does it look like looking from the military perspective?
Well, first of all, I think we just received a PhD level explanation of this from Ambassador Freeman. So I'm very hesitant to even think that I could add something of value. And the other thing I need to point out is my military experience. While I'm proud of every moment I spent in the military, capped out at a very junior field grade officer. I never, rose to the level of flag officer and commanded, armies and things of that nature. But it doesn't mean that it was insignificant. And I do have a history of being a good observer and watching people. I hung around with the guys that had the 4 stars on their shoulders, and I watched how they operated and such. What I would say, and again, this echoes a lot of what Ambassador Freeman said. My experience with the National Security Council, the national security decision-making process, um, started with the arms control business, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and watching that take place. And I just was very fortunate because of my absolute lack of expertise, just to be a hanger on. They didn't know what to do with me when I first was sent to the On-Site Inspection Agency, which is the Department of Defense activity that was created to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. I wasn't a missile guy. My Russian was rudimentary. I had a Russian history background, but I wasn't one of these esteemed foreign area officers. I mean, we're talking about guys that have 20, 30 years in who are experts in the Soviet Union and things of that nature. But I got to meet them and I got to listen to them. And then, one of the first things they did is I was the slide carrier for the guy that went to brief Congress about ratification. So my job was to carry the slides, put the slides in the projector and hit the thing. That meant that I got to spend a lot of time looking at slides, listening to people speak, watching Congress respond, listening to the questions that go back and forth, and then bring those questions back to the on-site and the inspection agency sit in the same room, because my job was also the slide modifier, meaning when they're, listen to questions, how we'd have to change the slide and look at the interagency process. And then I would, learn who these people were and where they came from. Realized that there were guys from Sandia National Laboratories. I said, what is that? And then I learned a lot about the Department of Energy and the role they play in, nuclear stuff. It was just a learning experience. The academic backgrounds of these people, where they came from. Harvard was a big generator of expertise. So the University of Kansas was big in the Soviet arena. And I just learned about how all this worked. And then I had again, it was just fortuitous, serendipitous maybe. I got injected into the process to where, as a lieutenant and a captain, I was suddenly briefing ambassadors and generals, and my stuff was being briefed to the president of the United States. I was getting letters of commendation from the director of the CIA. And so I got myself thrown into an environment of rarefied air. But again, watching, and what I learned back then is that even at that time, there were already heavily stratified vectors of influence in American policy, foreign policy making, that came from what today we can call the establishment, etc. So there were certain pipelines where people would enter the pipeline and then get molded and then injected into, using the system. I cheated because I bypassed all of that because of my incompetence. I wasn't qualified to get into that pipeline. I just was thrown in the middle of this. But what I also learned is that back then, as Ambassador Freeman said, there were only a limited number of players, only a limited number of voices. So if you were somebody like me, an outsider who was imbued with knowledge and information that was derived from a unique experience, for instance, none of these Harvard-educated guys were on the ground in Vaught-Kent seeing firsthand what was happening. I was. And so that's why I got invited to the table, and my voice counted because there were only a handful of people. I then transitioned. My next foray was the Gulf War and watching how the Gulf War went down. Ambassador Freeman was, I believe you were the ambassador to Saudi Arabia at the time.
I was, yes.
And I have in my files, and I still to this day, the communique you sent to all of us congratulating us at the end of the war for a job well done. It's one of the proudest documents I have, because we won a war. We handled the peace poorly, but we won the actual conflict, and it was largely because of the leadership of people like Ambassador Freeman and others. But again, I was a captain on General Norman Schwarzkopf's staff. So I got to see Stormin' Norman do his thing. I got to watch people come in and interact with him. It was a learning experience. And again, as a captain, I got involved in a very niche aspect of the conflict, the counter-Scud conflict, where I was considered to be the expert. And so my voice counted. I was able to bypass all of these PhDs and all of these master's degrees and all of this, decades of experience, because I had a narrow slice of experience that made me relevant at the time. And then I moved on to the United Nations and I watched policymaking. But here's a transition, because here we transitioned from, and this is one of the important aspects of where we are today, from a Cold War mentality, which still was prevalent even in the Gulf War. We were living off of the fruit of our Cold War labors, to this post-Cold War mentality. And to give you an example, expertise stopped mattering. What mattered instead was process, was procedure. We sought to get what they called the Cold War dividend, the peace dividend. And so what we were doing in the Cold War, what we did in the Gulf War, is very expensive in terms of manpower, etc. What we did is we went to what I call a cheat, where people became a master of, a jack of all trades, a master of none. Back in the Cold War, I could go to the CIA, I could go to State Department, I could sit down with a Foreign Service officer who knew Russia inside and out, who had been there on multiple tours and had the wherewithal, was given the liberty of speaking out and writing out about it. I could do the same thing in the Gulf War, or about arms control. But when I was in the Iraq business, what I saw is they transitioned out the experts and they brought in the the people that were going to put a 6-month stint in this office and then move in to get a broad-based experience. And then what happens is the institutions take over. And I think that's where we are today. My daughter just graduated from Georgetown University, a master's degree program in the foreign service area. And it was one of the most disappointing experiences in her life. She thought she was getting involved in a world that her father described to her, a world of experts, people who were truly intellectually curious, etc. Instead, she got into a factory that was rubber stamping people, just making people in a mold, and they don't want anybody who thinks outside of the box. And I think that's where we're at today, where we have totally subordinated, in accordance to what Ambassador Freeman talked about, our foreign policy to institutions that produce clones. We don't have any time today for people like me. I wouldn't thrive in today's environment. I would never be given the opportunities I was given back in the Cold War and the Gulf War as a junior officer. I would forever be the coffee guy for some lieutenant colonel who was, working for a colonel who was working for, and I would never get to the 4-star general. And that means that our foreign policy is held hostage by institutions who have a vested interest of furthering the interests of the institution as opposed to furthering the interests of the nation. That's my simplistic view from a junior officer perspective, and I'm sure Ambassador Freeman could probably show me where the errors of my ways.
On the contrary, I think that's very cogent. My experience is that the really bright guys in the military, if they're lucky, top out at lieutenant colonel. The guys with the blow-dried hair and the pinky rings get to be the flag officers.
No pinky ring.
But anyway, I think there's another dimension here, Jodishman, which we need to acknowledge, and that is I spent many years in and out of the Situation Room, the sit room, at the White House, dealing with quite a wide variety of issues. As you know, my career started in India, was very involved with all of the normalization of relations with China, and then ran the embassy in Bangkok and involved with all the residual issues of Indo-China wars, and then was in charge of Africa while we were negotiating with Fidel Castro to get his troops out of Angola and the South Africans to get out of Namibia. And then I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, probably the ambassadorship of the century, where 550,000 guys like Scott were my technical support staff. And Norman Schwarzkopf, who fortunately I got along with him very well because we were equals. I mean, he had the King Kong School of Management degree, as Scott will probably attest. Not my favorite style of management, but anyway, or leadership. But anyway, I sat in the sit room and on many, many occasions, on many, many issues. I don't think I ever once heard an argument about how to influence a foreign situation. What I heard was, what can we get away with vis-a-vis Congress? How can we handle the domestic politics of what we propose to do? And so it's very much the case that when foreign policy is no longer taken as seriously as it was in the Cold War, and expertise, as Scott pointed out, is regarded as irrelevant. So when we occupy Iraq, we send every campaign gerbil we can scrape out of the electoral process there. Whether they have any expertise or not is another question. Our foreign policy has become a pretty straight projection of domestic interests. And often it is fantasy foreign policy, bears about as much resemblance to the real thing as fantasy football does to the NHL. Anyway, so I think we've come to a point where the country's having a bit of a nervous breakdown, and we are in the midst of a transition away from expertise in the government. A great number of people are leaving, and amateur hours coming in. You look at the qualifications of the new cabinet, and and their subordinates, the effort to dispense with longtime civil servants and replace them with political hacks. And this is very ominous in my view. And it is not a cure for the mistakes that we've made, one of the most egregious of which is the war in Ukraine, but the support for genocide in Gaza and for ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And I believe the Trump administration is prepared, perhaps because Miriam Adelson paid Mr. Trump to do this, to endorse the annexation of the occupied territories in the West Bank. All of this is a disaster for our international reputation. And it leads to things like last weekend's contretemps with Colombia. Colombia has been taking plane loads of deported illegal migrants for years. There's no change. But Amateur Hour sent 2 military aircraft to dump people in Colombia with no prior clearance with the Colombian government, which turned them around. They landed somewhere in, I think, Honduras or someplace in probably Honduras in Central America. And the Colombians then sent planes to pick them up. But the issue is, the fundamental issue here is that if you humiliate someone personally or a country, which we just did, this is our best ally in South America. It is a country we enjoy a trade surplus with. The immediate reaction, it's the 5th largest purchaser of American corn, for example. The immediate reaction in Colombia is, okay, let's find somewhere else to buy our stuff. Let's look at China. The same day that all this happened, the Chinese ambassador in Bogota had a press conference, and he said, our relations with Colombia have never been as good as they are now. So what we just did was an own goal of a really bad sort. If we are interested in competing with China and others for influence internationally, as we should be, this was a dumb move. And that is what happens when you do not have people who know what they're doing and a system that is organized to deliver, through an organized process, deliver rational results. We don't have that anymore. So there we are. Time for your question.
Yeah, I think I would, as you said, there is not a single coherent foreign policy. The Black Caucus got hold of Haiti, and the East Europeans got hold of NATO expansion in Europe. And you said that the Zionist lobby got the Middle East policy hostage. So I want to start with Middle East, given the genocide, which is apparently stopped by the ceasefire, which led to a lot of false impression. And now we are seeing Trump and his real estate acolytes, whether it's Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner, talking about finishing off Gaza and sending their people to Jordan and Egypt and even Indonesia. I'm interested to hear your thoughts about what was this ceasefire, and how do we make sense of the ceasefire in light of these egregious statements that are coming out at a time when thousands of people are moving back to their homes, trying to couple together remains of their dead bodies, trying to honor them and rebuild their homes. What does it mean?
You want me to start?
Either one.
I always defer to the ambassador.
Oh, you shouldn't do that. Anyway, this isn't a ceasefire, it's a pause in the genocide, accompanied by an exchange of hostages. Interestingly, the Israeli hostages seem to be in great physical condition. They're not emaciated. They've not been beaten, at least not recently. They look healthy. The Palestinian hostages, released by Israel, look like they've been through hell. And I think that tells you something. The second obvious point is that, and that makes an impression on the world. which sees footage which we don't here in the United States because it's basically censored. The second point is the thesis that somehow or other Israel has wiped out Hamas is demonstrably false. You have pretty disciplined forces in the usual Hamas costume, anonymous with their green headbands and Kalashnikov rifles, and they are able to organize the hostage release in ways that demonstrate their continued existence. In fact, in one of the few true statements that he ever uttered, Antony Blinken, when he left office, admitted that Hamas has been able to recruit to cover basically all the losses it had during the Israeli war of annihilation against it. The third point is you saw typical Israeli behavior where Netanyahu breaks the agreement on a pretext. And the pretext is that another group, Islamic Jihad, did not release an Israeli hostage whom they held. That is now going to take place, I think, toward the end of the week, a few days before it had been agreed. But we have a typical pattern here where, for that reason, Netanyahu obstructed the return of roughly 300,000 Palestinians to the northern part of Gaza. So there are lots of things to be observed here, but a ceasefire leading to a peace is not among them. The talk that you mentioned, Joe Tishman, of pushing people into Jordan, the Sinai, Egypt, or even sending them to Indonesia, all of this undertaken without consultation with Egyptians, Jordanians, or Indonesians, is an example of pathetically incompetent hubris. The world does not dance to the tune of the United States anymore, if it ever did. And if it did dance to our tune, it was because we had people, knowledgeable people on the ground, foreign service, military, who were dealing with host governments in a way that persuaded them that they should do things our way, that the way we saw their interests and conform to how they should see their interests. Or in other words, that we were wise, we were persuasive, we were considerate, we didn't do things without considering the interests of others. This is the Cold War, because if we did do things that didn't consider the interests of others, there was always the danger they would defect to the other side. That's gone. There is no other side. So what there is a global order which is not composed of US and China or US, China, Russia, or India, or whatever, but is what I call multinodal. A node is a connection point where you can put thick connections, thin connections. It's three-dimensional, it can evolve, it can turn. It's a much better term in my view than polar. Multipolar. Pole is a line between 2 points. But we're talking about the rise of middle-ranking powers, Turkey, for example, as illustrated in its role in Syria, and many other instances, or India or Saudi Arabia, or perhaps some European powers that were once great but are now middle-ranking, like France. So I think things have changed, and this kind of effort to just dictate the way things will turn out is doomed to fail, and it has. Every country involved, Egypt, has flatly rejected the notion, as it had repeatedly earlier. Jordan, which is already 60% Palestinian, has rejected it. And the Indonesians, in their usual polite way, have told us to go away. So this is what that is about. The military situation, I'll let Scott talk about, but I want to just mention also that the Israelis have also violated the agreement, the ceasefire agreement with Lebanon, and extended after doing extensive, egregious, sadistic damage to the infrastructure in southern Lebanon, and actually shooting 15 people who were trying to return home and wounding 81 others in a display of callous disregard for human life. This war is not over. Israel has established its hegemony in the Levant militarily. Politically, it has never been more isolated and despised globally. And the question now is, will Israel, having removed the obstacle of the Syrian air defenses to an attack on Iran, go ahead and do that? And what assurances does it have from the incoming Trump administration about an effort to do that? I'll end by saying that the Jerusalem Post says that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to visit Washington next week in total disregard of the arrest warrant that the International Criminal Court issued for him. We are the biggest scofflaws in the world now, and the International Court of Justice's findings of genocide. So we're talking about a world that is not at all the one that Mr. Trump dealt with in his first term. It is a world in which American power is greatly reduced. Our military remains incomparable, but every other aspect of our national power has been degraded. Thanks, Mr. Biden.
Just building up on this, I love the multinodal concept. It's so much clearer than multipolar. So thank you, Ambassador Freeman, for educating me today on that. I'm going to incorporate it from now
Not
on.
original. Well, I can tell you the professor who came up with it.
But if you want insight into how complicated decision making should be in the real world, I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just want to again compliment Ambassador Freeman for his role in deploying 500,000 American forces into Saudi Arabia. That didn't happen because America said, we're going to do this. It happened because we sat down with the Saudis, we sat down with the Gulf Arab leaders, and we worked out a plethora of issues that needed to be worked out to make this smooth, so that it was done in a respectful manner, sensitive to Saudi sensibilities, but not just Saudi sensibilities, because we brought Syrian division and an Egyptian division and a Moroccan unit in there, and we had to deal with them. We built a GCC, Gulf Coast Coalition military force. We had to deal with that. This didn't happen because Stormin' Norman woke up in the morning, pounded his fist on the table and said, make it so. That only happens on TV shows. It happened because diplomats like Ambassador Freeman and his capable staff worked this out, coordinated, were pre-briefed in advance, were able to come up with point papers in advance because they were knowledgeable of the situation, of the reality, because they had real expertise that was appreciated by the decision makers. I don't know if you've written a book about that, but that to me would be a PhD level course on how to properly do diplomacy and military integration. The lead up to the conflict was textbook, in my opinion.
It was. It is a sad commentary on the Department of State and the Foreign Service that, unlike the military, which characteristically does hot wash after action reviews, some of them honest, not all, but very instructive. Yeah.
Budgets.
Nobody ever tried to examine why this worked. There is no book on that. I'm pushing 82, which is about all the exercise I get these days. And I'm not sure I'm going to write that book, but you're absolutely right. You learn more from failure than you do from success. But success in the build-up to the war was instructive and should have been carefully studied and memorialized. The war did not end in the way it should have, because we had no war termination strategy,
right,
which is a grave error, which we've repeated ever since. We didn't have a war termination strategy in Iraq. We didn't have one in Afghanistan. We don't have one in Ukraine. We don't have one for Israel's wars in West Asia. And we didn't have one in Vietnam either. So this is a pretty long-standing problem, which we really need to address. You shouldn't start a war until you know what your objectives are, whether they're feasible or not, whether you have the resources necessary to achieve them, and you hold to those objectives and don't move the goalposts. And when you've achieved what you set out to do, then the question is, with whom are you going to discuss this? You can't decapitate the other party. If you do, there's no one left to accept the reality that they've been defeated and they have to accommodate the new realities. We didn't do that in the case of Iraq. There's no evidence for even thinking about it in the case of Ukraine at the moment. That is to say, I hear more cockamamie, unrealistic theories about how we're going to end that war than I hear anything realistic coming out of Washington these days.
Yep. Well, I second that. I mean, we don't need to get into Iraq and the failure of Endgame. I was there when the war ended, and I spent 7 years in Iraq, suffering the consequences of a failure of an Endgame strategy. Noting that we didn't know how to deal with Saddam Hussein because we, in effect, decapitated him as the viable leader of Iraq politically, with statements made in the lead up to the war, and his continued survival after the war put us in a quandary, which now leads me to what's going on in Gaza. Look, there was a deal to be made. There's no doubt about it. And I think if we had a diplomatic team with the insights and experience of Ambassador Freeman and others supporting the President of the United States, and a president willing to let the diplomats do their job, there could have been a deal made that was lasting. Instead, we have a transactional president who is very superficial in his application of power. It's one thing to tell Netanyahu to sit down and shut up and sign a ceasefire agreement. Okay, we did that. Yay. But then what's the next step? For instance, who are we going to deal with on the Palestinian side? We say we don't want to deal with Hamas. In fact, Trump has said we won't deal with Hamas. But Hamas is the only one to deal with because they are there. Not just there, they are stronger than ever. If anything, these post-conflict videos show is Hamas is fully in control of Gaza. Their military was not defeated. Certainly they took casualties. So did the Israelis. But the difference is Hamas is not politically scarred by the casualties they took, whereas Israel is fundamentally scarred by the casualties they took. All Hamas had to do to win this war was survive, and they survived, and then some. Israel had the harder task of physically destroying Hamas as a military entity, which they have failed to do, convincingly so. This wasn't even close. The Israeli military defeat is absolute, and it's not me saying this, it's Israeli generals recognizing. In fact, the general who is in charge of supposedly shaping post-war Gaza has come out and said, we failed across the board. It's over. We not only failed to win, we can't win. The same thing with Hezbollah. There was an opportunity for Israel had they had advice from the United States. To give you an example, the death of Hassan Nasrallah it was disruptive to Hezbollah leadership, especially when they killed the second tier and third tier leaders coming up afterwards. There's a leadership today. Hezbollah is more than a resistance movement. It is a political party that is thoroughly integrated into the government of Lebanon. Hezbollah's political future is dependent upon the degree to which they take into account the needs of Lebanon as a whole, not the needs of a resistance movement. And so there was an opportunity for us to tell the Israelis, now that you've achieved this moment, what you need to do is let history take control. And what I mean by that is withdraw from Lebanon in its totality to include the Shebaa farms. You immediately delegitimize Hezbollah as a resistance movement. Hezbollah exists for the sole purpose of evicting Israel from occupied territories. The support that was provided to Hamas was secondary in nature. Hezbollah's role in the axis of resistance is secondary. Primary mission, and the only one that gives it legitimacy in the eyes of the Lebanese people, is the resistance aspect of it. If Israel had withdrawn, the political pressure that would have been put upon this new Hezbollah leadership to conform to the demands of the international community in regards to demobilization of the militia, incorporation into the Lebanese army, and making Hezbollah a responsible and productive member of the Lebanese government, you would have accomplished every strategic objective that the United States and Israel set out regarding Hezbollah. Because now you brought, but we didn't do that. Instead, what we've done is we've basically surrendered to Israel's prerogatives, which are panic driven. Israel was defeated by Hezbollah yet again. They didn't achieve the military destruction of Hezbollah. The collapse of Syria didn't bring an end to Hezbollah. Iran is still there. The resistance is still there. The resistance now is further empowered by Israel's irresponsible decision to stay on. And we are to blame. We, the United States, we could have been the ones to shape the reality based upon the political truths of it. Instead, we have a leader and his advisors who only take the Israeli point of view without understanding that the Israeli point of view does not lead to a solution. It, like a lot of what we do in the United States, is linked to domestic political imperatives that have nothing to do with Hezbollah and their situation in Lebanon, and everything to do with, can Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right coalition stay in power? What are the pressures being placed by the Israeli courts on Netanyahu? How do those pressures impact Netanyahu's inability to make the right decision in Lebanon? Can he afford the political consequences of withdrawing from southern Lebanon, opening himself up to accusations of surrender and being weak at a time when he himself is being attacked? And again, a good ambassador to Israel would be briefing the National Security Council on this, briefing the Secretary of State on this, briefing the president on this, on these realities, so that proper formulation of policy could be had. But instead, Donald Trump came in and said, I'm going to end the conflict on day one. And he created a made-for-TV moment where the conflict was then said to have been ended. The conflict hasn't ended. Hamas hasn't gone away. And then as he realizes that there are problems, I got to what do I do with 600,000 Palestinians who want to go home to the north? Well, we'll just remove them. So he arbitrarily says Egypt will take some, the king of Jordan will take some, without consulting the ambassadors there or the staffs and doing any of the legwork. This was stuff that should have been done a long time prior. If you wanted Egypt to take, Egypt would never take them, neither would the king. But if you wanted Egypt's help on what do we do about the Palestinian population, at least you go in and you ask that question. You begin the consultations, you begin the diplomacy. There is no diplomacy today. This administration exists based upon the unilateral dictate of a man, the president, who fails to use any of the tools available to him, simply speaks off the hip and expects everybody to rally behind. That may work when you staff your administration with, I got to watch my language, but people who kiss the behinds of people for political gain. But it doesn't work when you deal with sovereign states. And as we've learned, Egypt is sovereign enough to have said no. Jordan is sovereign enough to have said no. Indonesia is sovereign enough to said no. And it's not just saying no. The ill will that we are building now is making it almost impossible for competent diplomats to go in and repair this. We are digging ourselves into a hole in the Middle East, a policy hole that, unfortunately, because we don't have diplomats anymore, or we're not giving the diplomats we do have the chance to do the job of diplomacy, It will become a military solution, and we have insight into what that will look like when Donald Trump released 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, because that's the only tool the Israelis have. And unfortunately for the people of Palestine, for the people of Gaza, that's probably the direction we're going to end up coming back to. This was just a pause in a conflict, and we don't have the tool set necessary to resolve this conflict diplomatically or peacefully. And I am afraid that we are going to find ourselves back into a war. And it's a war that doesn't mean that Israel wins. Understand the damage that has been done to Israel. If you are somebody who is pro-Israel, Israel continuing the conflict in Gaza could mean the end of Israel. It could create internal domestic crises and exacerbates existing fissures that can bring about the collapse of Israel. So it's not about empowering Israel to defeat Hamas. Our failure to lead, our failure to have any sort of a diplomatic vision is probably going to end up destroying the nation that we think we're trying to help, and that's Israel. Israel is very much a weakened nation after this, militarily, politically, economically, societally. It's a disaster.
I think the correct analogy with Israel is enablement by the United States, much like someone enables a friend who's already drunk to buy more liquor by handing cash to him. This is not an act of friendship. It is not considerate. And we have aided and abetted Israel's self-destruction. Somewhere north of 600,000 Israelis have emigrated from Israel since October 7th. The army now is undisciplined. People do not report for duty when called up. The society is split, with the ultra-Orthodox fearing conscription because of manpower shortages that are real in the armed forces. The public at large, the remnant democratic element of the public, is deeply distressed by the end of judicial independence. Israelis of conscience, and they're not a few, are sickened by what they have done in Gaza and Lebanon. The military has suffered probably 800 deaths, but it has suffered over 40,000 casualties, wounded. And in any other war, these would be deaths but Israel is able to medevac people from the battlefield a few miles away to really first-class medical facilities. And it has saved a lot of lives that way. But these lives are ruined. Many of these people are eternally disabled. Others will suffer for the rest of their lives with post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a society also which has a collapsing economy. 64,000 or more small businesses have gone bankrupt as a result of the fact that their owners have been called to reserve duty and other factors. Startups, which were once the glory of Israel, which was a very creative society, very admirable in that respect, have emigrated. They're not taking place. And Israel's been written down by Moody's and other rating agencies, so it's going to have to pay more for loans in the future if anyone will lend to it. So this has been a bad experience. What Israel has done is killed a lot of Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians and expanded its territory. And this gets to the fundamental problem. I agree with Scott that Netanyahu is selfish, egotistical, and determined not to leave office to suffer the consequences of his corruption and the trials that he faces. He's now been in court. He looked very unhappy when he went there. But the broader issue is that Israelis, Zionists, have never been prepared to seek any kind of peaceful coexistence with either their neighbors or with the Palestinians. They want the Palestinians gone. They believe the only way they can deal with their neighbors is at the point of a gun or by dropping bombs on them. And they've done so. And the result is they are the most hated society on the planet now. And this, in turn, jeopardizes Jewish communities all over the world. Because to the extent that they are perceived by non-Jews as automatic supporters of Israel, regardless of what Israel does, this invites anti-Semitic acts. And we're seeing that with a rise in the real sort of anti-Semitism, not anti-Semitism in the ridiculous definition that Israel's imposed on the world, which means criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but anti-Semitism in the sense of attacks on Jews. I consider Israel's Zionism to be the negation of Jewish values, not the affirmation of them. And I'm sorry for those Jewish communities abroad who are now caught in the crossfire. But they are safe. Jews in Israel are not safe. And they are in a society that, as Scott indicated, is in real jeopardy of disappearing. Let us remember the precedent of the two Christian kingdoms that were there 800, 900 years ago. They didn't last very long because eventually they alienated their foreign support and they could not survive without it. Well, look at what's happening in our politics. Young people are totally disenchanted with Israel. Young Jews don't want to be associated with it. And in fact, the strongest voices against the genocide have mainly been from Jews. I take my hat off to them if I had a hat. So I think this has been a bad set of decisions, catastrophic, really, by Netanyahu and company for their country. And it sickens me that we have been complicit in this. We have aided and abetted it. We have supported it. We have funded it. We have, as Scott mentioned, supplied all the weaponry to conduct genocide. And we've done so unflinchingly under the Biden administration. I'm sorry to see the Trump administration continue this misguided policy.
I want to have one more rounds of discussion on the Middle East, given I want to touch on something that Scott discussed when he was here the last time. It was the context of coming of the HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, to Syria. And I want to place three broad questions, and I'm clubbing them together in the interest of time, so that we have a round of discussion before we, if our time permits, move on to other segments of U.S. Foreign policy. How do you guys look at the the influence of the United States in the region after the collapse of Assad government? Has it increased? Has it decreased? Because there has been a talk for some time after, particularly after withdrawal from Afghanistan, that the U.S. influence in the region is on the ebb. But we are seeing huge construction of embassies slash CIA fortified operation complexes in Lebanon and so on. So I'm curious, with Assad gone, what happens to Western influence there? So that's my first question. The second question is what Scott discussed last time, which is the balance of power between the Sunni world and the Shia world. And I'm not bringing Palestine in this case because the Shia-Sunni divide doesn't explain Palestine, but it's definitely an issue in Iraq. It's definitely an issue to some extent in Syria. And we know from various records, Hillary Clinton's leaked WikiLeaks cable, Joe Biden's speech in Harvard, Prince Bunder's confession to a British intelligence officer, I think he was Richard Dearlove, that the Saudis, the Qataris have always funded the radical jihadi Sunni movement against what they see as a Shia alternative. So what happens to that balance of Shia-Sunni within the region? And my third question would be, would the coming of the HTS as a radical Sunni jihadist movement in the region create further instability among communities, particularly in Iraq. I am bothered given the long history since 2005-6 between Shia and Sunni, but also in Syria. So these are my three questions. Sorry for clubbing these long questions together, but I think this is a window to have the
Well,
final round of discussions.
I regret I have limited time, but let me make a few brief comments and then I will defer to Scott, which I should do always anyway. First of all, Israel has accomplished the impossible. It has united Sunnis and Shia against it and us. And far from producing a coalition composed of Israel and the Gulf Arabs directed against Iran, Israel is now driving Iran and the Gulf Arabs together in an effort to balance Israel, which has established its hegemony in the Levant and threatens further expansion. If you doubt that, look at the map of Greater Israel that is on the Foreign Ministry website, showing Israel extending to the Nile and the Euphrates, with everything in between, including parts of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, all of Syria, Lebanon, and of course the Sinai and Egypt east of the Nile. This is not the sort of posture that will enable Israel to exercise influence, and to the extent the United States does not stand firmly against it, we have zero influence in the region. Finally, you asked about Hayat Tahrir Hasham. This is a case of a very politically wily group, aided by us, by the Israelis, but also trained largely by the Turks with us, that has successfully conquered Syria, wants to have a united Syria. Its interests coincide with those of Turkey, which also wants a united Syria, so it can clobber the Kurds in the northeast and get rid of the threat that they pose to Turkish domestic tranquility. Israel wants to fragment Syria. It's always wanted that. It hopes it will break up into 4 or 5 little statelets, which Israel then can manipulate to its advantage. And there's now a direct conflict between Turkey and Syria, which will be very interesting to watch play out. Hayat Tahrir Hasham has put on a very good show of being a bunch of cuddly liberal democratic jihadis, which strikes me as a bit of a contradiction in terms, but it's essential if they're going to get Western aid for the reconstruction of Syria. And so I appreciate what they're doing. I note, however, that there have been massacres of Alawites. There have been murders of Christians. There have been other atrocities committed by elements of the loose coalition led by HTS that is now in power. And the fact that Shara, formerly known as Al-Jolani, now wears an Armani suit is not convincing evidence that we're not facing an extremist regime in Damascus. That concerns the Gulf Arabs terribly. You know, they were all for backing Sunni extremists against the Shia. They've overcome that. They've reconciled with Iraq under Shia rule. They have not reconciled with Hezbollah in Lebanon, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them do that. They do not want a Salafi extremist group running Syria. In that area, their interests coincide with those of Russia. Russia is what, 15, Scott, you'll correct me, 15+% Muslim, and very concerned about the spread of extremism among its Muslim population, and very determined not to see Syria move in that direction. That was one of the reasons, among several others, that the Russians came into Syria to back the Assad government. So we now have the Saudis and others competing for influence in Syria, primarily to preempt that kind of extremism from taking hold. How successful this will be, I don't know. But the Chinese brokered rapprochement with Iran is maturing. It is accelerating. It is growing. It is not disappearing. And this illustrates a point that Israel has established its military hegemony at the expense of its total isolation.
I will second this. We speak of, the role of the United States. I think we need to recognize that, at least from my perspective, that genuine diplomacy in the middle. There was a time when we had a category of people we called Arabists in the State Department. That time is long since gone. Today, we have people who have to be aware of American domestic political prerogatives, which are almost predominantly pro-Israeli in nature, and that's captured everything. We've subordinated our Middle East policy making to a large extent to the military and to the CIA, and understand that neither the military nor the CIA are looking at standard foreign relations aspects. The military looks for, it's about a military problem. How do we position ourselves to be able to close with and destroy the enemy through firepower maneuver to accomplish the problems that have been set forth by the national security strategy of the United States and the Department of Defense's interpretation thereof. The CIA is just simply out to cause havoc. That's what the CIA does. It doesn't have any ability to think strategically. They were told to get rid of Assad, and they sought a path back in 2011, I believe, taking advantage of the Arab Spring, and they succeeded. Hats off to the CIA. They, unlike the State Department, do wash-ups, and they are going to write the history of how this timber sycamore or whatever this thing, how it worked. I mean, just like they did with Afghanistan. I mean, they've written books, internal volumes about the success of Afghanistan, not realizing that they married themselves to a process because these paramilitaries, these case officers, now graduate, they will get medals and they will go to the CIA and they will become legend within the CIA. And all aspiring case officers and paramilitary operatives will be looking to the guys who brought down Assad. And they're going to say, that's how we do things. And now the CIA is married to this model, which is not transferable, by the way, because it was dependent upon a lot of things that are unique to the Syrian case. But America is now going to be sucked into the vacuum that we've created, but not with the right people, not with the State Department, but with the military who doesn't want to be in the Middle East anymore. And the CIA, go ahead.
Well, I have to leave because I've got
Okay.
guests arriving momentarily, but I just want to defend the military and the CIA a little bit. They are instruments of statecraft. And they follow the direction of the constitutional authorities. And the constitutional authorities, if they're nuts and inexperienced and unwise, can use these instruments to wreak havoc. One of the things we need to do, we need to restore the concept of statecraft to our government. And it is a top-down process. If directed, the military will follow an order. If directed, the CIA will try to subvert the order, but eventually they will come to heel, in my experience. The Foreign Service, I'm sorry to say, Scott, you're quite correct, has been hollowed out and is a mere shadow of what it once was in terms of intellectual power, area expertise, linguistic competence, cultural sensitivity, and so on. And this is a shame because empathy, the ability to understand the viewpoint of someone you're trying to persuade to do something, is the key to diplomacy. And empathy is quite different from sympathy. You don't have to agree with the other party, but you have to know why they think the way they do and define their interests the way they do if you're going to have any hope of changing their view and persuading them that they should do things your way, which is what diplomacy is all about. We've lost that ability. And what's happening now is further eroding the possibility of restoring it. But I am sorry, Judge Mann and Scott, I do have to excuse myself. I will listen for the doorbell, and at that moment, I will take myself off the call.
Yeah, maybe just Scott can sum this up, and that would be a good discussion in itself.
Well, I just want to just say in closing that Ambassador Freeman has already summed it up. Look, there are new realities that didn't exist in 2011. Uh, China has interjected itself with an outstanding diplomatic intervention to bring about a rapprochement between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran that is defining, political realities in the Gulf. Russia will not allow Turkey to turn HTS into a platform for the insertion of Islamic fundamentalism into Russia, where again 15% of the population is Muslim, and there are sensitivities and sensibilities. There was a Chechen-Russian war. Russia doesn't want to revive that. Kazan, the capital of Tatarstan, was noted for its bricks, but remember, Kazan in the 1990s was seeking secession from the Russian Federation, and Russia was able to appease that through making conciliatory measures, which they don't need to be undone by Islamic radicalization. And Turkey is a problem, though. Turkey has weaponized HTS. It's not just Syria that's in its sights, but Iraq. Turkey feels that a great injustice was done at the end of World War I, where the Vilayet of Mosul, major oil producing region, belongs to Turkey. They feel that the British arbitrarily drew a line on the map, and Erdogan is seeking to undo that. And so I think there's going to be a lot more pushback. Remember, China is concerned about the number of Uyghurs who are involved in HTS, and they don't want that to come back. And so this isn't just about the radicalization of this Al-Qaeda offshoot. This is about redefining the region in a way that the United States, who started something in 2011, doesn't quite understand what the new realities are. Russia and China are major players. They will continue to be. And Saudi Arabia isn't the compliant tool of American policy that it once was. They are seeking stability. That stability requires an extension and continuation of this rapprochement between Sunni and Shia. And so I think it's just a different world. And again, I just wish we had a State Department that was capable of dealing with these complexities, because no problem lends itself more to sincere, informed diplomacy than the problems of the Middle East today. And unfortunately, again, I'm not denigrating the military, but the military isn't a substitute for diplomacy, and the CIA certainly isn't a substitute for diplomacy. And unfortunately, those are the two most effective arms that we have in the region today, and that's not what we need right now.
I agree.
On that note of agreement, and in the interest of time, we'll conclude this as part one of probably and hopefully many more parts that can come together. Ambassador Chas Freeman and Marine Officer Scott Ritter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.